hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Okay, welcome to the next installment of Miss Marple, wherein I am doing a reread of all of the Marple oeuvre from Agatha Christie in chronological order. So, of course, we started with The Murder at the Vicarage, and now we are on The 13 Problems, which is also known as the Tuesday Night Club, though that's the reason I think they ultimately kind of changed the name is because The 13 Problems is a collection of interconnected short stories, and the first 6 are at the Tuesday Night Club, the next 6 are at a different dinner party at the Bantries, and the final one is sort of just like a follow-on. So I think The 13 Problems is a more appropriate title, all things considered. But before I get into that, I should let you know kind of how things run here in Miss Marple. So I feel comfortable saying that this is a spoiler-free review. Here is what I'm going to talk about in this video. I am going to do a plot synopsis that will take you up roundabouts to where we find a body, though because this is short stories, I'm not going to really do that so much in this particular video because it would often be spoilery. I will get into character details. I will certainly do that. That may or may not be something you consider to be a spoiler, but I'm going to talk about the characters and some of their foibles in detail. And then I will also get into a lot of thematic things. So my particular lens for this rereading project is talking about this book in the context of kind of social and cultural history, as well as Agatha Christie's sort of own development in terms of how she talks about morality, good, bad, right, wrong, all of that kind of stuff. And then at the very end, I will have a spoiler section in which I make no representations. I will feel free to spoil anything in this book and anything in the Christie canon. So I will let you know when that happens so that you have plenty of warning. But with all that being said, that's what we're gonna do. So let's talk about The 13 Problems, which, if you remember, going into this project was what I thought was my all-time favorite Miss Marple book. So let's find out if that holds. So, as I said, The 13 Problems is a bunch of interconnected short stories that have a bunch of recurring characters, obviously, because they're interconnected. And kind of the framing device of this is that it all starts at a dinner party at Miss Marple's house in the little hamlet of St. Mary Mead in England. And she has 5 guests. She has Raymond West, who is her nephew, who is such an ass. I did not talk about that in Murder at the Vicarage, but like, what a boob. He is a writer of very like depressing, very like artistic modern novels. Like he writes like sappy, like mopey white guy lit fic that like probably in a different time would have included him talking a lot about his junk. Like, in hyperbolic terms, I don't know. He just seems like he writes terrible books that I would not enjoy reading. So her nephew is there. There is an artist named Joyce Lempier, I believe is her last name. There is Sir Henry Clithering, who is like an MVP of this collection. I love him. I also, in my mind, always call him Clittering and laugh because I'm a 12-year-old boy. But he's an he's the former head of Scotland Yard. There is the clergyman named Dr. Pender who is there. And then there's also a lawyer named Mr. Pitherick. I don't really know how to say his name, to be honest with you, but all of them are there and they're having a dinner party, and basically it comes up, they kind of are talking about could they solve a murder, and they kind of agreed to continue to meet every Tuesday night, and each of them will tell a different sort of like murder mystery story that the others will have to try to solve, which is, you know, a very contrived framing device, but it is effective nonetheless. So they go through that, and then we fast forward in time a little bit, and Sir Henry Clithering, sorry, I really am a child. Henry Clithering is staying at the house of the Bantries, Arthur and Dolly Bantry, who are a goddamn delight. Dolly Bantry for the win. Love her. He asks them to invite Miss Marple to their dinner party. Also there is Jane Hellier, who is a very famous film actress, so she is at the dinner party as well. And then finally Dr. Lloyd, who's a medical doctor, he is also there. So there's again 6 of them, and again they get into, this time, one long ass dinner party at the Bantries where they each tell a murder mystery type story, or like a puzzle of some kind. There's not always murder, and they each take a turn at solving it. And then finally the 13th story is one that happens a little later with Sir Henry Clithering and Miss Marple basically in the 2 main leads. We go from there. So that's sort of the framing device. I think I'll start by telling you some of just my general impressions and thoughts about the stories as a whole, and then I may have to get into the spoiler section sooner than I like, just so I can get a little bit more specific, but let's dive in. So, a few things that this book does that I really like. So as I said, coming into this, I thought that this was my favorite Miss Marple book, though when I went back and looked at what rating I gave it, initially I only gave it 4 stars, and now I would give it a 4.5. So I guess I'll go ahead and spoil that and tell you that this is now, I would consider to be number 2 to me to The Murder at the Vicarage. I do think The Murder at the Vicarage is a little bit better. But that being said, I think that, Agatha Christie herself, it should be noted, said that she thinks that Miss Marple works best in short stories. And I agree, because Miss Marple, it seems to me so far from my reading, is often not at the center of the stories that are being told. She's kind of off on the side. So I think having her be a minor character in a lot of ways works better when it's a short story. So in the sense of true, the heart of what makes Miss Marple great, I think that this book has a lot of that. And that's why I think Christie felt like she worked so well in short stories, and I think that's why I remember Miss Marple short stories so fondly. And I will also say that for this collection in particular, I do think that the interconnection piece of this is pretty effective. I really like kind of as the stories are progressing, you see that all of these characters start off by completely underestimating Miss Marple. So she also, I have to say, in this version of Miss Marple, she is much more frail than I kind of ever have thought of her being. She's sort of piled in 10 layers of black lace and is hunched over with basically a lace doily over her and lace glove. She just seems very small, old, and frail, versus I tend to think of Miss Marple as sort of more in the country tweed version of an older British woman. I guess probably because Angela Lansbury is who I tend to think of as Miss Marple, and that's sort of more the thread of elderliness that she is sort of embodying. But in this story though, Miss Marple is literally sitting in the corner weighed down by 20 layers of lace, and so nobody is taking her very seriously. But as the book as the stories go on, and especially in the first part of the book where they're coming back over the course of 6 weeks, everybody's respect for Miss Marple grows a lot. And consistently what you see in these stories is, again, you really are getting kind of to the heart of what Miss Marple's detection strategy is, which is A, think the worst of literally everyone. Just assume that humans are terrible and capable of the worst thing you can think of. And 2, she just always has an analogy about something, some little thing, the mystery of the lost gill shrimp comes up multiple times in this, of somebody losing their shrimp on the way home from the grocery store. She'll pick up a story like that and then have this comparison to it to solve the murder that's at hand. She just knows all, she's so observant of the humans around her in this little village, and it allows her to just figure shit out. And as the stories go on, everybody is getting more and more respect for her. And by the end of it, Sir Henry Clithering has so much respect. He, explicitly wants her to come to this next dinner party at the Bantrys. And over the course of that long-ass dinner party where they tell all these stories, apparently, everybody really grows in their respect for her as well, because she just consistently is the one who can see through the bullshit and figure out what happened. So I think that, in terms of short story collections, I think that this is a really effective, collection. And I think that if you're somebody who tends to be a little more kind of trepidatious about going into a collection of short stories, because I know that's not everybody's thing, I think that this would be an easier one to sell to people in some ways, because I do think that there is a kind of narrative arc. And I do appreciate moments where you feel like Agatha Christie is sort of commenting on kind of just the form that she has. Notably, my favorite moment of this was when we come to Dolly Bantry's story. I think it's maybe the 8th or 9th story in this collection of the 13 of them. And she literally says what I'd kind of been thinking to myself, which is damn, all these people, we're having to suspend disbelief that all these people are able to just sort of on the spot come up with these fully developed stories, and they're recreating dialogue and giving you all the pertinent clues interspersed strategically throughout their narrative. And I had the thought to myself of okay, this is something that we're having to kind of suspend disbelief about. But by the time we get to Dolly Bantry, she literally says I don't know how all you people can tell these stories so fluidly. I don't know how to tell a story. And she literally just gives you the barest bones of her mystery, of her story in 3 lines. And it's basically oh, one time I was at this house and they accidentally served us foxglove instead of stage and someone died. Like, that's literally basically what she gives you. And I just thought that was such an effective comment from Christie about her own narrative choices. And then I think it's called The Herb of Death. I think it's one of the better stories in the collection, because then what the story becomes is the rest of the characters sort of eliciting more details from her. And I think that just narratively was a really effective choice. I mentioned that I really love Dolly Bantry, and I do. I really love Dolly Bantry in this, and mild preview of things to come. But she is the center of the next Christie book called The Body in the Library, and she's even more of a delight in that book. But she's just very, like, she reminds me a lot of Ariadne Oliver, who comes up in the Poirot books, starting with Cards on the Table, which is in the future. She has a lot of the same sort of just like exuberance, over the top, sort of just like joie de vivre, and like she's just a pleasure to spend time with, and she breathes a lot of like energy onto the page. I think in the Marple verse, I'm wondering if she is equivalent to Ariadne Oliver in terms of just like anytime she's in a book, she makes it better, just because she just has such a kind of lightness of touch. She says really funny things, and you just are on her side. I just really enjoyed her. I enjoyed her the same way that in the last book, in The Murder at the Vicarage, I just really enjoyed spending time with Griselda. That's how I felt about Dolly Bantry in this book. And I also, another parallel to Ariadne Oliver is Joyce Lampier, in terms of her constantly kind of talking about women's intuition and women knowing things. That's definitely a big part of Ariadne Oliver's character. So anyway, just, I don't think that's a spoiler, but just like a parallel to the Poirot verse, is that I think both of those characters have some positive parallels to Ariadne Oliver. With any collection of short stories, you're gonna have highs and lows. Most of these I think were pretty good. I will tell you that one of them, if you don't want to have any details of a setup in a short story ruined for you, maybe skip forward like 60 seconds in this video. But I will tell you that one of these has like maybe, like, it's a testament to how good of a writer Christie is in terms of like her ability to try to sell you on the setup. But she has this setup that's supposed to be very atmospheric, and it's being told by the clergyman, Mr. Pender, as being like a very, you know, spooky, atmospheric country house type mystery that he's setting up. And it is risible. Let me tell you this in like the parallel to today's world, and then imagine that Christie is trying to sell you that this is really ooky, spooky, creepy, like atmospheric. Imagine if there was a super rich guy who lived in like Ojai, California, or like Malibu or something, has like this country house, and on the grounds of the house are Native American burial mounds that are from the Navajo, the Dakota, and the Inuit. Okay, if you know anything about where those tribes are from, but it's in California, it's in Southern California. That's what are all in these burial mounds. And as a testament to that heritage, this super rich, like, Hollywood film guy, maybe, has built a sacred totem pole, which again, like, think about the tribes I mentioned, and then imagine that there's a totem pole that is meant to commemorate all of these tribes, and that when people go out to this, like, totem pole that he has erected on this sacred ground for all of these, like, completely nonsensical cultures to be in one place, everybody is like, oh, I can feel the spirits of, you know, the Native American shamans who have been here before, and I just feel like something bad's gonna happen. And so a Hollywood starlet that he has staying with him is like, you know what we should do tonight? Let's have a dress-up party and then come back out here and, like, party it up. That's what we should do to celebrate this ooky spooky atmosphere. And everyone's like, you know what, you're right, that's exactly what we should do. And then later on, she comes out dressed in, like, some really offensive like costume of, like, an indigenous shaman or something, and then tries to, like, entrance everyone with her, like, whatever. It was, like, so absurd, and I just was sitting there like, only Agatha Christie could make this even vaguely feel menacing, because this is so laughable. And I think to some degree in the narrative you're meant to see that as laughable, but, like, anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as, like, there are moments in this collection where you're like, this is not your best work. But that being said, I do think more often than not, these are really pretty good short stories. In terms of, like, some of the thematic things that I saw going on, I do think that we get so, like, another kind of autobiographical element here is that Miss Marple was inspired by Agatha Christie's own grandmother, and so it's interesting to see, and her grandmother was a very formative kind of, like, figure in her upbringing. It's interesting to see the attitudes that apparently inherently were very formative to Agatha Christie's own development as like a person in terms of right, wrong, good, bad, because Miss Marple is like savage. She like she talks often in here about like how she is super pro death penalty because like, and I mean, you know, people disagree about that, but like the kind of way she talks about being pro death penalty is pretty like, damn, Marple, like it's just like pretty pitiless. She always just believes the very, very worst in people, and she always is seeing through any kind of veneer somebody has of like respectability. She can just take one look at them and be like, oh, you're a killer. I'm gonna keep my eye on you and try to warn the person I know that you're trying to kill because like, I see you and you're not going to get away with it. I really like, there's a lot of just like little personal details in here that I really enjoy. Like she takes a lot of little swipes at Raymond West. So I do think that we get, this is sort of an early example of kind of older and younger generations interacting in Christie and kind of having active commentary on it. So she often is commenting to Raymond West about how naive he is, or just like, he clearly is discounting her because of her age, and she is clearly discounting him because of his age, but like in the mix of things, we're meant to see that like he's young and modern and like doesn't know what he's talking about. So I thought that was kind of an interesting, it's a theme I definitely think you see in, at least in the Poirot canon later on, like by the time you get to the 60s and 70s. But usually in Poirot up through like the 50s, there's a lot of sympathy towards the younger generation and kind of their point of view. But it was interesting to me that in this book, I really don't think you see that at all. Like really her sympathy is much more with like the older generation and their wisdom. So I don't know, it's just sort of an interesting contrast, I think, between kind of her two different detectives and people's take on things. I think particularly in Raymond's story, which is called Ingots of Gold, he just comes off looking terrible in that story. He just looks like such an idiot. It's just interesting to see sort of his kind of misogyny and ageism is consistently turned over on its head. So I'm thinking that that is going to continue to be a major theme in the Marple canon, the way that xenophobia was a major theme in the Poirot canon. So that's a lot of the kind of thematic stuff I can get into without being too spoilery. The only other thing I guess I'll say is that I do also think you get some interesting kind of insights into the dying gasps of British aristocracy also being both like socially very powerful and financially very powerful. Like I think that you see in this book several instances where you can kind of see that dying away as the 20s ramp down and the 30s ramp up, that just the aristocracy is never going to have the same kind of prestige, power, and money that it does pre-World War I. And I think you can definitely see that in this book at some points. Oh, I guess I should also just say two other themes that I saw, or like one theme and one other criticism I have. Let's start with the criticism. I do think that it's a weakness in this book that everybody who tells a story has to know what the ending is and share it, because it causes contrivances that I think are just not necessary. So I wish that she had just like allowed some of these to be like solved for the first time by Marple and then be like, oh yeah, that probably is what happened. I think that would have been better. The other theme I just thought I would mention is that this book consistently over and over and over again is undercutting ideas of supernatural causes for things. And given that there are some explicit like religious things that come up in here as well, I just think that that's interesting. And if you kind of know some of Christie's biography and having, I think, some pretty healthy skepticism of organized religion in particular, but just generally like spirituality being something that can be used to prey upon people, like I definitely think you see that in this collection for sure. And one other shout out I just wanted to give is that I really enjoyed listening to All About Agatha's podcast. I listened to all of their kind of discussions on these short stories. If I was going to give you one to go listen to, definitely go listen to their episode about the thumb mark of St. Peter's. I think they do such a good job of just like roasting how savage Miss Marple is in this short story. And it was just it was a great episode. In general, I really like that podcast, but there are 13 stories, so like recommending all whatever that is, like 5 or 6 hours of content to you, it seems like a lot, but the thumb mark of St. Peter I think is the best of their episodes they did on this collection, so I would commend that to you, so just if you're interested. So in terms of ranking, I would leave The Murder at the Vicarage as number 1, and then I would put this as number 2. So I gave The Murder at the Vicarage 5 stars and I gave this 4.5, so stay tuned, we'll see how we continue to progress. But that is sort of the end of my non-spoilery thoughts, so if you would like to leave now, thank you for watching, I'll see you later. And if you would like some spoilery thoughts, stay tuned for that. The first one that I wanted to bring up was about the short story, The Bloodied Pavement. I basically just wanted to bring this up because this sort of like blueprint for a story, I think we see so many times in Christie. So we see this whole like, this idea of the bait and switch of a husband and wife, and is the husband, like a couple of kind of fundamental pieces come up over and over again. Who is actually married between the husband, the wife, and the mistress? Like the three in a love triangle. Like who is actually married? Are the identities of each of the people who they should be, or are they different people? And then the use of one part of the triangle to kill off another part of the triangle. Like these are themes that come up over and over again in Christie. So like some parallels here. Evil Under the Sun for sure is the one that really comes to mind here, I think. I also think that there's some parallels a little bit to a Caribbean mystery in terms of that comes later, but just in terms of like husband, wife, who's trying to kill off who. Also like a recurring theme of like serial murderers, basically, of doing this over and over again. Dead Man's Folly, I definitely think there's some parallels there. And then like the Triangle at Rhodes, all of those, I think, I'm not saying that they're one-to-one the same, I'm just saying that some of the kind of underlying DNA of those stories, I think, have a lot of parallels, and I think that thematically they have a lot of parallels. So that one definitely stood out to me as like, this is a very Christie story. Like this really is something that she does a lot, and if you're a Christie reader, I think as soon as you saw a husband and a wife and then a third person show up, you would, maybe I've just read so much of her, maybe I remembered this story, but immediately I was like, oh yeah, okay, so they're the two that are actually married and they're gonna off this other one. Like that just is it's a very Christie kind of plot line that she has. Another kind of Christie hallmark that I was reminded of was in The Companion, this idea of when people are abroad or people come from abroad, you don't totally know who is who and if it's the right identity. In particular, it kind of reminded me of Hercule Poirot's Christmas, kind of the elements of the various characters in that who are coming from overseas and who their identity is or isn't. I also think in that there's this recurring theme in Christie, I think, of the interchangeability of women. And I think it's interesting to think about that. I don't know, I'm going to kind of sit with that, but she definitely has this idea of the interchangeability of young women who bear their bodies that comes up in Evil Under the Sun. I also think that she talks a lot about that in Poirot, like young people and the way they dress. Females, the way they dress, makes them very interchangeable, and she uses that to subvert identities. And in this case, she's essentially commenting on the interchangeability of older British women, and this essentially would have been her by then. And I don't know, I want to sit with it more, but I think she has like a little passage in The Companion kind of describing how interchangeable all of these kind of like middle-aged, tweedy British women are in this era. And I just want to think about it more because I think it's potentially significant in terms of understanding or thinking through understanding of her own gender identity. And I know that that's not a term that she would have thought about at the time. I'm not trying to say that she was conscious about this, but just kind of reader response and us as 21st century readers looking back and reading back into the text. That's definitely something that has been intriguing me so far in my reread, is really looking at the way she depicts women and their bodies and the way they dress and how they are perceived by others. That is a big thing to me in this reread. Which actually leads nicely into the last kind of point that I wanted to bring up in terms of the last two stories in the collection. So I think that the Jane Hellier's story, like that story, which is called The Affair at the Bungalow, I remember from my first read, I was like, didn't one of these stories involve somebody thinking about murdering someone and Miss Marple finding that out and calling them out? And no, it's actually this, The Affair at the Bungalow, this sort of theft that Jane is kind of preparing as a way to ruin people who have wronged her in the past. And I think just the undercutting of our perception of Jane Hellier all throughout the book as being very dumb and dull-witted and completely self-absorbed, and just this little twist at the end where she's like, hey, I am a really good actress, and how, you know, she's kind of set up this one perception of her as sort of this dumb actress, and the fact that no, she's maybe not so dumb, or maybe there's more to her than meets the eye. You know, what you see isn't always the truth is always my big kind of recurring theme, and is the underlying thematic context of all mystery. But I think in this particular case, the way she uses kind of Jane's presentation as a certain type of woman to play with our expectations, I think is really interesting. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just thinking that there's so many. This is a book that has a lot of thwarted female rage now that I'm thinking about it, because the last story is Death by Drowning, and just the sexual jealousy of the ultimate murderess. I think you definitely see that. You see in the Blue Geranium, the unfulfilled sexual longings of this nurse makes her kill. I mean, like, there's a lot of sort of like thwarted, jealous women in this who act violently, and they're often women who are kind of socially discounted for one reason or another, either because of like their intelligence, like she's just a dumb blonde or a dumb actress with Jane, she's a nurse, she's a, you know, just cleaning woman or whatever. Like, there's a lot of discounting of women who are more powerful than they appear at first glance. So I don't know. I think I want to sit with this more and kind of keep my eyes open for it in future books. But there's a lot of like, I feel like there's a very strong reading, like feminist reading you could do of this particular book, but I'm starting to think of the Marple canon in general. Like, I feel like this would be ripe for feminist literary interpretation. So that does it for the 13 problems. We are 2 books now into Mission Marple, so we've got The Body in the Library coming up in 2 weeks. I have already read it, so I can tell you that I did really enjoy it, though it is savage, like brutal. Wow, it was a lot. It was more than I remember. So anyway, if that entices you, it's also a super short Christie. I feel like my edition's not even 200 pages, so it might be a good one for you to jump in on if you haven't read any Christie to date. I'm really enjoying this reread of Marple. I'm liking Marple so much more than I remember liking her. Now, that being said, the first 3 I do remember as being my 3 favorite, so maybe it will kind of go downhill from these first 3, but yeah, so far, way into Marple, liking her so much better than I remember liking these. So I'm excited to keep going. So I hope you will join me for The Body in the Library on February 15th. And you can also join in discussions over at the Goodreads group, which is Mission Marple Book Club. So feel free to join in the forums there and chat with other people who are doing the read along. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having a really lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!